So I've gone ahead and set these to a more reasonable value, and now we're going to take a look at the first drop down here in the Hairs tab, which is Roots. Now one thing we're going to do before we really get into these options here is also go to the Editor tab. And in here, we're going to go to the Display option, which is currently set to Guidelines, which is showing us the guides, and we want to set this to Hairlines. And this is going to give us a representation of the hairs on our object. Now I'm not going to go over the rest of the options in here, but the one that we do have that is really easy to get into right now is the detail, and this is just a percentage of the number of hairs you've specified in the hairs tabs. If you are going to be using this option and you have a lot of hairs, you'll probably want to set it to a fairly low value, something like 3%. And you'll see that still gives a fairly good representation of the hair that is applied to this object, while still giving me something that's going to be fairly easy to navigate around in the viewport. So once we set that, we can go back to the Hairs tab, and we'll take a look at the different root options here. The first option that we have here for the root is Auto, and this just means it's going to use our guides and try to randomly distribute the hairs in between those guides. If we take a look at the dropdown, you can see that a lot of the options here match the options that we had for the guides themselves. So depending on how we want the hairs distributed on the object, we can choose different options here. If we want the hairs to be weighted based on the polygon size, we can adjust that, and you'll see that smaller polygons get a denser seeming distribution of hairs. And if we render, you can see that on the edges we also get that same distribution in the render. If we set the option to polygon area, this is more or less like the auto mode. It's just going to take all of those hairs and try to distribute them evenly across the surface. Again, we can render, and you see that you get a much more even distribution of hair across the surface. Going to the next option, we have an option here for polygon center, and you'll see the first thing it does is knock down the count of hairs. And that's because it's taking the count and it's limiting that to the number of polygons that we have on the object. If we render, you'll see that although the guides are dispersed somewhat randomly across the surface, the hairs are now growing only out of the polygon centers. Going to the next option, we have the polygon vertex, and just like the center, we can only reach a maximum count, which is equal to the number of vertices on the object. And if we render, you can see that all the hairs are growing from the vertices of the object instead of the polygon center. The next option that we have is polygon edge, and with this one we can increase the count just like we could with the guides, but this time the hairs are just being grown along the edges of the object, and if we render, you can see that we can clearly see the edges from where the hair is growing there. Finally, we have the UV and UV grid, and just like with the guides, this is going to function the exact same way. You would need a UV map for your object, and then at that point all of your hairs would be distributed based on the size of your UVs. The final option that we have here is as guides. And what as guides is going to do is render your guides as the actual hairs. So you'll see all the guides that we have here. If we click on render, those are taken directly across for the actual hairs themselves. We're just going to go back and set this to auto again. And we'll also set the count back to 60,000. Now to show the as normal checkbox here, we're going to add a little bit of styling to our hair. So we'll go to the simulation menu, choose hair tools, and then the brush tool. And we can just brush some of these guides. And you'll see as we brush the guides, the hair is updating as well. And that's very important. So now that we have that styling there, we can go back to the hair. And you'll see that the way that the hair grows from the object is straight out from the surface. So it is following this guide 100%. If we check as normal, you'll see that the first segment that grows out from the hair surface grows straight up. So it's following the normals of the object. And if we adjust these segments on the hair here, that's going to adjust exactly how far it seems to kind of come out of the hair before it bends over. So if you need to be sure that your hair is separating from the surface or has a little bit of lift from the surface, the as normal checkbox might be one that you're interested in. The next option is offset, and what offset allows you to do is offset your hairs from the surface. So you'll see as we increase the offset, the hairs rise away from the surface, and this is according to the normal direction of your surface that you're working with. A negative offset allows you to inset the hairs from the surface. So we'll just set this back to 0. The other option that you have is extend. extending the hairs is going to extend them from the base of the hair itself. So in conjunction with offset, you can kind of work with this to keep the hairs attached to the surface somewhat. Generally, you won't need to adjust these values here though, so you should be pretty safe with leaving them set to 0, 0. Where you would want to change this is if you have problems with the hair actually lifting off of the surface at render time.